All right. I think we're all properly refreshed now. I hope everybody's done a few, whatever it is, planks, jumping jacks. I'm sorry, I'm from an earlier era. The plank is still a mystery to me. I'm not quite sure how you do it, but I'll do some swan flapping wings next time. All right. So we're now getting into Act 2. And in Act 2, you're going to take what you created in Act 1, that institution organization, you're going to say, okay, so how is it going to look at something? And Act 3 is going to be a really different challenge, but Act 2 is something else. Act 2 is going to ask you to look at the past, to say, how could we assign different approaches to dealing with something like the COVID pandemic? So what you're going to be doing in Act 2 is the following. You're going to be taking the resources, structures, etc., that you designed in Act 1 for your organization, and you're going to be doing just that. You're going to be picking one aspect of the COVID pandemic, up to you which one you want to address, and say, that didn't go very well. How would my organization go about designing a whole process, a whole approach that would make things at least resilient, better yet, anti-fragile? And careful here, because you don't want to be thinking about things that are very, very specific or overly specific to the COVID-19 pandemic. In other words, we all would agree that having better respirators would be very useful indeed. If you've spoken with any doctors that sadly had to manage the equipment during the peak of the pandemic and the process of intubating people and so on, they will tell you that it's extremely difficult to handle, even under the best of situations, let alone when you've got crisis mode. So certainly better procedures and so on would be useful, but that would be specific only to the type of things that we're saying, well, what if you have respiratory problems or respiratory challenges similar to COVID? But that's not really what we're looking at for Black Swan. It's more along the lines of saying, well, look at a deep level, what didn't work or what hasn't worked, since frankly, we're not out of the woods yet, right? And say, can your institution, because of its unique design that you created in Act 1, propose, suggest an approach that will work to deal with some aspect of COVID in a way that was not possible or did not happen or hasn't happened yet during this pandemic? I will add one thing as a side note that's not so much a part of the game as just a food for thought. I've seen things come up in these games that I've said, you know what, try taking it to authorities with the capacity to make it happen, because sometimes some very interesting thinking happens. But even if that's not the case, that's what you're going to be doing in Act 2. Pick one aspect. Don't try to deal with the entire pandemic. That's way, way, way too much. And just pick one aspect, one element. It might have something to do with a social interaction. It might have something to do with a resource. It might have something to do with how jobs, we're not talking necessarily just about the aspects of how to deal with health. We might be talking about what jobs were lost during the pandemic, what jobs became very dangerous during the pandemic, okay? Can we fix that? Can we make them work better? Can we make them deal, can we deal with something that needed to happen, but could we have thought about it at a deeper level in a different way, such that it wouldn't look the same? But do it within the scope of how you designed your organization. If, for instance, you designed an organization that has no buildings, do not propose an approach that says, well, my organization will bring everybody into these big buildings. So, sorry, you designed something that didn't have buildings, and that's fine. If you design something that, for instance, has sandboxes, then think how sandboxes relate to that aspect of COVID that you'd like to address. So that's Act 2, all right? And we're going to be running on Act 2 until, again, if we're looking at Pacific time, 1 p.m. Pacific. Okay, so translate that to whatever your time zone is. And you're going to have just around an hour and 15 or so to work on this. You'll now have a new document labeled for Act 2 that has that information and some more additional materials, as well as another template for you to fill out with some questions that look the same, but some that look very different. because now you're not creating an organization. You're looking at the past to create a proposal for how that past could or should or could have been different or should be different towards the future. All right. You can, of course, you should go to the same rooms that you want to that you went to in the first part, because we all keep the teams together. But start talking with each other. If you're saying, well, you've now heard each other and you say, wow, we're doing this, but the other team is doing that. Maybe we should send a representative over to speak with them about this aspect that we think they could take if we could do that in constructing a response to a pandemic event like COVID-19. Do it. That's the whole point. That's why you have these teams. That's why the game looks at this aspect. Oh, and one more thing. You saw me all come through in the first act just to check in, everybody, make sure everybody is okay, and so on. You might see me in a very different persona in Act 2. You may not like that persona, but just be ready to have somebody ready to speak for your group should that persona come by. I'm not going to say anything else. Just you should have a representative ready. All right? Any questions before we break out into the groups? Again, the rooms will be open, everything's ready. And all right, so if everybody is ready to go, then go to your breakout rooms and see you, well, maybe sooner, maybe later.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Hope you all enjoyed your sessions, and we're going to check back in with Ruben to talk about what we're doing next.
All right. So thank you all. Also, thank you for those of you who had me swoop in as the evil yellow press reporter, Black Swan. It's if Hearst newspaper still existed, that Black Swan would probably have worked for them back in the day. But it's always interesting to see how people react to saying, let's just challenge some of your basic reasons for existing based on somewhat malicious interpretation. Again, it's the sort of thing that can help you think about clarifying a little bit how you think about your institution, what you do, and so on. And why are there so many Rubens? I noticed that too. It's a Black Swan in and of itself. You see, what happens is, remember the transporter? Well, there was a transporter accident. So, okay. What we're going to do now is I'm going to ask each of the groups in turn to very briefly explain the aspect or detail the aspect of their response to the challenge. In other words, which aspect they chose of COVID-19 and how their group will deal with it. So without further ado, let me see from group 1A. Is somebody ready to present on that?
Yes, so we understand the question regarding hiding costs and also how we might respond to COVID as a successful business model. Unlike traditional educational models where costs of programs and overall, oops, I have the wrong camera on, excuse me. Unlike traditional educational models where costs for programs and overall university overhead are hard to measure, our connection-driven university model allows us to measure costs because we are a platform and can scale up and down as needed based on the tools that both we use for our own students, as well as the ones our partners leverage as they start to pay for our platform. We know the exact cost per learner and even the API costs for partners leveraging our platform, and therefore we can demonstrate the rationale for increased costs as we scaled during COVID. Smaller institutions and individuals looking for alternate education partnered with us as they didn't know how to achieve distance education or alternative educational experiences on their own. As investors, we very much appreciate your concerns about your interests, and we have some promising and emerging developments in light of COVID-19. We believe that our investment in engagement frameworks and tools could be allowed to use for partner educators and institutions to reach out to those students who may have dropped out for a season during COVID. There was a gap also in learning events, but also possibly learning quality. So our competency-based assessment, which we've reinvested in and productized, we believe can help improve catching up students to find out where they're at and accelerate their re-engagement into learning and education. We believe that this can be used on a go-forward basis. Lastly, we believe that we can pivot to assist what caused the problem. Institutions were not prepared to transition to asynchronous online learning, and learners didn't have the systemic support to continue their studies. Our connection platform will allow us to have an opportunity to help others pivot through this period of digital transformation. Finally, as an open learning network, we believe that Unbounded can scale to assist learners, especially working adults, who will need more education, not less, as they pivot to new careers post-COVID. And we have a little bit of a hunch that this isn't the last event to hit us, even today. And so we believe that this platform will scale and respond, and especially the fundamental skills taught in polymath and new liberal arts models will allow us to continue to meet the needs of emerging learners and industry labor. And so our partners with industry and our model will allow us to stay relevant and assist learners and educators because we are a network and we connect learners with learning and needs. We are unbounded. Think, do, learn, repeat.
All right. I am beyond impressed. That has to be the best PR response to a challenge, plus a great description of a response to the Black Swan event itself. I think, you covered it beautifully. And one of the things I like is, once again, this is true anti-fragile thinking, because what you're describing is not just a patchwork, which is what I've seen, or a kind of, here, let's take something that's not very good and just make it not so bad. It's no, you're engaging with this at a level at which you're addressing the entire scope of what was involved in terms of the stopping, skipping a semester, to use your terms. In other words, that distancing from the learning and saying, well, how do we take the picture to make what comes out of this better at the other end? So I think it's a beautiful anti-fragile response. And even my persnickety journalist self is satisfied that this is a good PR response. So kudos on that. Really, really good job. I'm very, very impressed with it. So thank you. Wonderful. How about team 2A? Hi, 2A.
My name is Laura, and I'm speaking for the Learn to Learn Academy group. So the failure that we identified was overdependence on lecture-based synchronous and asynchronous online classes. Students or learners experience Zoom fatigue. They turned off their cameras. Too much sort of attending lectures only in an online format, synchronously or asynchronously, encouraged disconnection and passive modes of learning, or we could even call learning in that mode consumption. Good. So what we propose as almost like a parallel experience to the classes that we will offer at Learn to Learn Academy and the micro college format is, and now reading from a script so that I represent well my all my team members. Based on principles of cognitive theory of learning, learning scientists will guide learners through a challenge-based experience selected by the learning scientist and the learners. Throughout the experience, learning scientists and learners will use Kolb's experiential learning cycle paired with evidence-based learning strategies for students to apply throughout the experience. Resource materials will be provided in the form of recorded video, digital materials, and asynchronous content to prepare for meaningful interaction that will occur. And this means we're thinking of meaningful interaction between students, smaller groups, so not the groups of 20, but smaller breakout groups. And those interactions could occur synchronously in person or online. And as the final reflection piece of the challenge project that they undertook and all the sort of observations they did along the way about their own learning from a cognitive standpoint, and reading the final sentence of the script, learners will do and reflect on their practice as they develop proposed solutions for the challenge.
Again, very nice. And once again, I'm fascinated by the fact that, reading through the solutions, we keep coming back to the idea of anti-fragility, right? Because this isn't just about, okay, let's figure out how to quickly put in a couple of quick shims to fix things. And this is really about saying, how do we bring in, true evidence-based learning work, evidence-based research about learning to inform how we do learning, but again, not just as a patch, but to actually change things moving forward. In other words, this may be the trigger. The event of the pandemic may be the trigger, but it really changes things moving forward. So again, this is, once again, beautiful anti-fragile design. It's exactly the type of thinking you'd want to do. And believe me, if you want to take this to any college or university right now and say, hey, we should be doing this, you have my full backing for it. So great job. Thank you. How about group number 3?
I believe I will be speaking for group number 3. As you can see, I've lost my accent. We have some visuals, so I'm going to share my screen, which I apparently can do. Yes. Whoa. Okay, there we go. I think. Can y'all see the Google Doc? Yes.
We can, yes.
Okay.
Yep,
I'm
looks
going
good
to
here.
assume you can see the Google Doc. All right. So we decided that our key role here as facilitators of conversation or knowledge from as a think tank is that we saw as a critical failure during the COVID response the failure to create a clear science narrative for both the public and policymakers. So first of all, as far as the press release is concerned, we don't believe in talking about what we're doing. We believe in showing what we've done. What we have here is a failure to communicate. We blame press releases for much of that failure to communicate. They are unidimensional, predictable, and often seek to score PR points at the expense of clear communication. Our organization communicates using a variety of media, and we make every effort to ensure that we are clear in each of them. You may judge us on the basis of our work. So these are some examples of things that we could do. I believe Ruben has volunteered to, Ruben Puentedura Signorelli has volunteered to read the verse portion of our effort today.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for that forceful rebuttal of Ruben Puentedura's comments on Ruben Puentedura's prose here. We decided that one way to approach communication was to be playful and do a limerick. Hence, here's our group effort. Please don't judge us on it. There once was a man without shots, so COVID gave him blood clots. We tried to enlighten him. He preferred to stay dim, so now he inhabits a plot. Thank you, Ruben. I turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much. But we realize that not everybody wants to read text, and so therefore we recognize that visual communication is critical in all of this. Given the very limited time frame we had in order to construct this, we were forced to construct a comic. There's nothing wrong with that per se, but perhaps a more elaborate comic would get the point across more clearly. But we're kind of proud of our efforts here, especially our super talented Better Watch Out Karina, Laura the birdie drawer. So, so Laura is going to read her part, and I'm going to read the part of science. Go ahead, Laura. You first.
Right, so much info. Things keep changing.
Science is a process of exploration. It doesn't tell you what new realities are, but it gradually reveals more and more of them. When you land on the shores of a new land, you don't know what's over the horizon, but make reasonable guesses about what to expect. The more data we have, the more we understand what we're seeing.
Rather than being confused by new information, we encourage members of our community to explore the ramifications of what newly acquired knowledge provides.
And on to the next panel. Go ahead.
How can I be safe?
Risk cannot be eliminated, but you need to soberly evaluate your risk factors when making decisions about what to do. Even safe can be unlucky, but anecdotes are not science.
And ultimately, you have to make the best decision possible within the limitations of the information you currently have at hand. But why won't someone tell us what to do?
Policymakers are basing their decisions on the same kinds of uncertainty that scientists have. It's hard to establish a consistent policy, and it may even be bad as facts change.
But decisions remain and actions remain in our hands. Why should I get vaccinated?
You want to mitigate your chances of rolling snake eyes. The vaccine isn't perfect, but it's very good at mitigating your risk. More importantly, blue birdie getting vaccinated protects all the birdies, no matter what their color. But is the vaccine safe? There is the unfortunate side effect that the vaccine will turn some birdies into Ruben Puentedura. One of our many innovations was discovering this nefarious side effect, signed Ruben Puentedura. And then we hand it back over to you, erstwhile host, Ruben Puentedura, if that is you.
Well, okay, so first of all, I have to check and see in the vaccine side effects database where you enter becoming Ruben Puentedura. I'll check with the CDC how I go about entering that. Second, you realize that now you've thrown me into a philosophical quandary about speaking to myself and the identities of indistinguishables and whatnot. You're bringing back memories from many, many years ago.
So, your time in the mental institution?
Yeah, exactly. Again, getting to your proposal, first, I truly appreciate the visual communication aspect of it. It's remarkably it speaks to the heart of your institution. So the advanced play aspect comes through in how you're choosing to communicate, and to boot, you're also dealing very explicitly with the question of a key failure during the pandemic, which would be a failure of any pandemic, or should be addressed. Hopefully it won't continue to be a failure in all pandemics, but if you're talking about addressing something that isn't just a feature of the COVID pandemic and that's it, but rather a feature of all Black Swan events that in some way resemble the COVID pandemic, it's that aspect of communicating the science in clear ways. So I like very much the chosen approach and the chosen focus of that approach. I think it works well. I think it also becomes interesting to see if you were talking with somebody about saying, well, okay, but how do you get the message across to broader audiences? It'd be very interesting to see how you can expand, de-double the play aspect, so that for an audience that, for whom the comic type approach or the graphic novel, whatever you want to call it, type approach might not work quite as well. How you can nonetheless reach to the heart of what you've developed and say, what would other forms of play look like for reaching other audiences? So again, you have a very intriguing avenue for communication, and I can certainly see where a faculty and student body can respond to Black Swan challenges using this approach. So thank you. All right, a group 4A, please go ahead then.
Oh, okay. We talked about a number of things. One thing that we talked about quite a bit on dealing with the COVID challenges is the focus of access and students. The impact of the COVID pandemic really spread open the issue of access to to learning in many ways, lack of internet, lack of, students that were homeless, all of these kinds of things. And the other thing was we talked about a lot about the student support issues that were obviously not available that were needed. How do we manage students' personal and psychological well-being? And if it's all remote, how do you do that remotely? There's been more literature coming out. I've watched a couple of I've read a couple of articles that have come out lately that talk about the need for student services across the entire country as universities have realized that there isn't the support that we need for online students. And so providing online student services for mental health, for for well-being in all forms is really something that has bubbled up to the top that needs to be addressed by everybody. And again, like I said, we had a couple of new people in the group that were international that also talked about access in their own countries and student support services in their countries. So it's not an American problem, it's an education problem. And it talks to equity and the issues that we are seeing, needs for all levels of equity in education. So that was a lot of our conversation, was particularly student services, support services for students who were put online unexpectedly, and equity for students, particularly those who were put online unexpectedly.
Thank you. One quick question, Chris. Again, in terms of how you focused on the topic, I agree that if I were picking, central elements regarding students and the pandemic, that would be indeed a very good choice, because once again, not just limited to COVID, but it applies across a very broad range of scenarios that are connected to it. I'm curious about whether you discuss specific aspects that had to do with your design of your alternative university institution. In other words, so what? Yeah,
we did.
Ahead,
and the thing that brought that to it was one of the elements in our design for our university was taking students and giving them the opportunity to engage in and immerse themselves in other communities and other cultures as a part of their learning experience. And so we were talking about, the impacts of COVID. And if you're looking at, you want to send students to another country, they do need access to these services. And, how can we establish that kind of a situation in an online environment? And it kind of was a big topic that we touched on all different areas of it. But because of this international element in our design, we were trying to figure out, what international needs are, and equity and access were absolutely an international need. We also talked about how are we going to get people to get to other places, which led to the conversation, well, how can we simulate that in a virtual environment? And if we can't simulate for the well-being of our students in a virtual environment, how are we going to be able to immerse them in a culture where they may feel more isolated and they may feel less engaged in that, and absolutely not immersed in that community? So that was how that conversation led one thing to another.
Great, thank you. And again, I appreciate also you're bringing in the international dimension into the picture. There are some absolutely fascinating possibilities involved there. And I think in many cases, sometimes in the case of COVID, I'll take a second and speak for some of the groups I've worked with. For all of us, it was crucial to have that international dimension in every possible aspect, so that some of the blind spots that we saw develop in terms of responses to the pandemic in the US were, I don't know whether to say alleviate, but certainly you are less likely to get into them with that international perspective. And I hope vice versa, that we helped contribute something in terms of to participants in the conversations from other countries, in terms of helping them deal with their corresponding or different but related blind spots. So I think there's some very rich possibilities that come into the picture when you're thinking about an institution and thinking about, you've had actually the concrete conversation today, but also how that international perspective is articulated. Sometimes I look at some institutional designs and they seem to only view the international aspect in it, for lack of a better word, client type relationship, but the type of partnerships instead that you're talking about here. It's not trivial to get some of these partnerships working, but what you're describing is exactly along those lines. And once again, a potential source of anti-fragility. So thank you. All right, group 5 then.
Okay, hi, hello. I will be talking again for our group. We are Seoul University, SOL. I know there's some confusion about, or some really exciting branding prospects in the chat about who we were. Our group has gotten a lot smaller, so we may not have access to everybody's ideas, but I'm going to share the best that I can for what we had. So the COVID-19 response failure we chose was inconsistent access to reliable technology. And we really considered a lot of different things. We considered computers, Wi-Fi, communication technologies like Zoom, cloud software like Microsoft OneDrive or Google Drive, as well as different LMS systems like Blackboard, Canvas, and Brightspace. Why? We think that the significant impact to many areas that come from Black Swan events are a barrier to solving other issues, and we don't want technology to be one of those barriers. So our 5-second pitch is that we believe education is about ideas, how we connect and interact with them, not just about technology and tools. So we deliver, or want to deliver, education, experiences, and connections that can be accomplished with bare bones technological tools, your mobile device. So you could access all of your education and teach and grade, and all the stakeholders could do everything with just a mobile device. So we are investing in the research, design, and support needed to create effective mobile-first minimum viable technology and engaging learning experiences. That's the short answer. So I feel like that comes with a lot of different considerations. We tried to talk about as many of them as possible. I think we all had in our group different ways that we were interested in thinking about this. We tried to come up with some examples. So one example, if logistics was taken out and all the roads were taken out and some truck drivers were no longer needed, it would be one potential student, right? They may have limited access to technology and limited access to Wi-Fi, but they're still likely to have a mobile device, and we want that student to still be able to access our curriculum from wherever they are. Some major components. So we are not just a fully online school. If you remember from our first presentation, we would do both a physical location and a online place. So the pieces that we were talking about required of our physical location, we would want to be able to deploy independent field institutes to damaged areas that do not put a demand on the local infrastructure, but can support the recovery of hard hit areas, specifically by fostering building networks with employers in that area, providing study and meeting spaces for students, and then providing additional technology, not that it's required, but sometimes you want it, right, for increased learning support and training such as labs or maker spaces. And then if you want to see a lovely Jamboard that we've been working on, it is, I guess I could share the link so that's easier. Sorry, I was getting tired. So let's see, anyone, and I'll pop that in the chat if you'd like to look at it. So I think that's where we're at. And then I'll invite any of my group members who'd like to kind of share any other ideas that I may have missed or presented poorly now, or I'll try to answer questions.
Right, so let me First, thank you for sharing the Jamboard as well. I think this is a whole rich field. I'll put in a quick plug here to mention that your approach dovetails with some of the work that's been taking place in the ShapingEDU group in terms of broadband and access, and thinking about how that works. But again, not at the level of, and you put cell towers every so many miles and so on, but really getting into some of the deep aspects that you're talking about here. So thank you for the focus on that. One of the comments I'll make is that this also gets into a very interesting, different type of relationship to Black Swan events. In other words, clearly it relates to pandemic type events, but you can start saying, wait a second, this is also operating in a meta level that would apply across a broader spectrum of Black Swan events. In other words, when you're thinking about how this is going to be relevant, this type of issue, this type of inconsistent access to reliable technology and how your group would address it and so on, becomes relevant across a very wide range of Black Swans. So there's something very interesting going on here. And for those of you who looked at the materials for the big, not the materials just for one of the acts, but for the Black Swan game as a whole, and went through it. If you look at some of the materials that are included in there on the Kumbaya Mela, and this extremely large, for lack of a better word, it's a pilgrimage, of course, it's a religious event, but it also generates a pop-up mega city. And understanding what that is, the type of approach you're describing has parallels with the type of approaches that are described in there. And again, I'd encourage people to think a little bit about how that works. How do you see this type of approach as putting layers of analysis that can help illuminate how to think about Black Swan projects, how to think about anti-fragility in the design process. So thank you about that. That's really great. All right. And let's see, we have then last couple of groups here. So let me see, how about the not-for-profit group and NFP1?
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I've been nominated to respond for our group. Actually, several of my colleagues had to head out for childcare, which sort of leads us into our conversation. As you know, that our non-for-profit group's title is Fill the Gaps, and we had an hour worth of discussion as to some of the real life issues that came up on so many different levels in communities as well as on college campuses. And so we struggled a little bit, but I would say what we would like to be is a center, or at least have satellite campus on the campuses that we serve. We would have a satellite office. And what we would be a group of individuals that you would come to, say, for example, if you were struggling adult learner and you were struggling with this COVID, because all of a sudden you have children at home and your job, maybe you lost your job and you're not able to afford a babysitter at that time. And so you fall through the cracks in the school because that's the first thing that tends to go. So instead of doing that, you would come to us and say, I really don't want to miss out on school this semester, but here's all this issues, and we would try to work with them to figure out, if it's a babysitting service situation, could we facilitate that through some way through the college? Or is it a computer issue? Or on some level, what we were dealing with too was one of our team members worked through the Navajo reservation that is so cut off from so many things. So we had long discussions about that. Would we have to send up some kind of balloon so that there would be some electronic Wi-Fi service up in there? So our organization would figure that out. Of course, we got a little stuck on all the red tape, and our goal would be to be the ones to actually cut that red tape, but our 5-second thing is don't fall through the cracks. We'll fill the gap. So that's where we're at right now, considering there was only 2 of us. The others had to take off because of other issues. I think because we're so fluid at this moment, we don't have a huge byline.
Beautiful. And as was already mentioned in the chat, I agree. Thank you for considering the aspects relating to child care, and so on, because the role they play in multiple types of Black Swan events, but definitely have played throughout the COVID pandemic, are central. I'll also point out that in many cases, when I look and see where solutions have fallen short, it's because it's been focused at the level that is one step removed from the actual child. It's rather a level focused on the institution such as it exists today in around that child, whether it's traditional childcare or school, etc., and less about what you're talking about, which is exactly this type of fill the gap approach that relates to the child itself. So thank you. I think that's an excellent approach. And again, an excellent choice of a COVID-19 topic to highlight for a response. So it really is a wonderful.
We found a lot of even just our undergraduates had to stay home and couldn't get online because they had to take care of their little sister. And so that became a big issue.
Absolutely. And in fact, it's, this is the sort of thing where it'd be almost, no, it would definitely be worthwhile setting up another day, a session just to focus on this topic. Because again, when you look at saying, how do you think about this? You keep coming back to some of the barriers that people ran into, some of the missed solutions or lack of solutions have a lot to do with where you focus your thinking. And once again, focusing on just patch the box that you were using to take care of that child, rather than saying, hold on, let's take a step back and think of what anti-fragile design relative to children would look like. So this is a really important one, so thank you. All right, last group. So we have then group TSC1.
Hello, that's us here, the real life startup group. So thanks, Ben, for standing in for me in the previous presentation. I just had to disappear for a few minutes. So we focused on the anti-fragility aspect of COVID-19. Specifically, when the beginning of the pandemic, we were very fragile in the sense that we were at that situation because of the education system we have all been through. Most of us were not ready for facing such a huge turn of events, or a black swan event in this case. It's because we didn't have the right kind of information literacy, the kind of information that we should believe in. So we fell to a lot of misinformation. The other aspect was we didn't have, I wouldn't say a deep knowledge, but even enough knowledge of science and even belief in science to be able to take the necessary steps to protect ourselves. And also the cultural context that such a virus can affect anybody and everybody, irrespective of where it came from. And we are all exposed to it as such. So again, to be able to think as humanity and as everybody, because like in the case of a pandemic like this, you're only as safe as the people around you, specifically those who are vaccinated or not vaccinated, or so many other aspects as such. So how to be able to build an education system that takes into consideration all of these aspects and not the current one. And we are focused mainly in the K-12 space, because I think that is where a lot of changes need to happen, specifically in the way the subjects have been taught, which are very siloed. And we don't live in a siloed world. We live in a real life world in which things happen to us. We're exposed to science or math or social in a normal day-to-day life. We don't have segregated boxes like we have in a classroom environment. So our idea is to be able to build an anti-fragile education system that develops a habits of mind to face unexpected turn of events and create solutions. That is really what the background in order to be able to build a solution as such. And we really did a 5-minute pitch, so it's very hard to come after a poem and and a visual representation. So I'll make this very short. So, and like somebody else said before as well, we will continue to face an unpredictable future pandemics or climate change or social political order, and so many different scenarios that we'll be able to face. And how do we prepare young students to be able to have a mindset that they will be able to face such incidents or pandemics to be able to thrive in their future careers? Not just, and again, don't want to have an education system that's just purely focused on future careers, but also in their personal lives, to lead a satisfactory and a thriving life as well, in spite of any other careers that they may choose. And in order to do that, the way the curriculum or the content, what you can call it, or the courses, to be able to build what we call as a procedural memory. And I'm trying to associate it with a muscle memory as such, because the more you practice a particular task, for example, you get used to it, like playing basketball, for example, practice it, and you know how exactly to aim a ball at it. So the same way, the more we learn how to solve problems and using a problem-based approach to learning rather than a subject-based approach to taking tests and learning, we'll be able to have more imagination and use more creativity and more problem solving. Because the students who are in school right now are going to have a variety of different problems that they would have to solve in life. And so if they are more prepared for that kind of an environment through their education, by not just test taking, by having more project-based, transdisciplinary learning environments, they'll be able to face these future challenges much more better. So also learning through emotions as well. And I think it's important for everyone to be able to accept what we go through as humans and to be able to learn accordingly and learn to accept that and use that as well. Like that's the reason why mindfulness is such an important aspect to be integrated within learning, to be able to accept and to be able to face that. And creating a learning environment that is more immersive in the sense that they should be thrown into the challenge, and the challenge moves as per their responses. And again, as per the levels as well. So somebody in a primary school could get a similar challenge, but will be able to have the problems that are at their level compared to a secondary school student who would have to dig more deeper, more wider across more subject areas, and something that's a little bit more futuristic as well, so that they're able to handle that. So that another important aspect is having a mindset of openness to learning. I think the habits of mind is a really good way to be able to describe it, is taking responsibility, learning how to fail, and but persisting, and that's the resilience that they need to be able to build. And also to be able to rely on data, rely on science, rely on information, but also question the information that is out there. Again, also be able to bring in the human aspect of empathy into it as well. So we learn how to work together in a connected way. So that is really how we envisage how we can reshape education, specifically at a K-12 environment, because I think that's an important step to be able to build for future education environments like an university.
Thank you. I think, as we have already talked about in the previous, reporting out stage, in the previous feedback stage, I think there's something very compelling about what you're talking about, designing as a product, as part of a startup. I think once again, you're going well beyond the scope of where many content providers, for instance, have been, and you're really delving into deeper ground. I think this also starts to tie in with what we talked about in academic, in the alternative university context, as playing off a evidence-based learning design approach. So I think there are some truly rich possibilities here. And once again, I think also something that you've pointed out that gets to the heart of things that did not work out during, or have not worked out, I should say, during the COVID-19 pandemic, and certainly should be considered for any type of anti-fragile design for similar events. So thank you.